I want to ask you about the Russian-Ukraine war. President Zelensky, we know, has accepted the US peace deal, and earlier today the White House released details of President Trump's discussions with Vladimir Putin. Douglas, Trump is pushing the Russians to agree to an unconditional ceasefire, but so far Putin has only ordered his military to adhere to a 30-day ceasefire on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Zelensky says he fears the Russians don't want an end to this war. Douglas, what do they have to gain by extending this mutually disastrous conflict?
Well, what Russia has to gain is that they will hope that Western support for Ukraine runs out or runs down, and that they can slowly, incrementally, whether or not during this presidency of Trump's or whether during a future presidency, continue their war and take over the whole of Ukraine as they tried to do in 2022. I mean, it's extremely hard with agreements with people like Putin. Not that there are that many, but we have quite a number of dictators in the world now, as always. It's hard to know what of their word you can trust, because the obvious thing is absolutely nothing. Zelensky is answerable not just to Western political alliances that are supportive of him, but it also, of course, has to be having the backing, the support in the end of the Ukrainian public and indeed the Ukrainian army who are fighting on. Whereas Putin doesn't really have to have anyone's support. It's just himself, his own view, along with a small number of people who are around him. And so then, you have this sort of thing of, well, what of Putin's word can you trust? And I don't think anyone who's ever dealt with him or ever seen the way he deals would think that you can trust Putin very much. The promise not to attack energy and other infrastructure is not a very useful promise from Vladimir Putin, given that it's one that he's given only within recent weeks and promptly done exactly what he said he wouldn't do. He gave another assurance some time ago that the Russians would not attack Ukrainian energy infrastructure, and then the next night, actually, whilst I was there, they did exactly that. So it's extremely hard. President Trump is trying to negotiate a final peace, and I think should be admired, acknowledged for doing so. But it's an extremely difficult deal to pull off, and we'll see.
It is extremely difficult to pull off, as you've explained. To the UK, you've written about this issue, the attacks on free speech, free expression. The Starmer government there wants a working definition of the term Islamophobia. I could help them with that, but I don't think they're going to like my suggestion. You've argued that Islamophobia laws are just censorship, another attempt to invent special rights for just one faith group. What do you say to those who argue Britain's Muslims need further protection?
Well, I think it's pretty outrageous for lots of reasons. I mean, one of them is that British Muslims have the same protection as any other citizen in the United Kingdom. You're not allowed to harass or, attack places of worship or buildings or anything else. And those laws exist for everybody of any faith and none. And the problem about this attempt by the Labour government, with a really disastrous former Conservative MP leading it, to set up this commission that's going to try to identify so-called Islamophobia is among other things, it's simply not going to work. Nobody's ever been able to satisfactorily define Islamophobia because it's almost impossible. In fact, it is impossible to draw a line between, among other things, to allow it to remain legal to say anything critical of the religion of Islam or anything that seems to offend any large Muslim group or indeed any individual Muslim. I mean, when people in the UK, as in other Western countries, start talking about Islamophobia laws, among other things, I really want them to answer the question of why it is they are so obsessed with this non-issue of defining an absolutely indefinable term, and why they don't spend more time, for instance, instead of talking about this fake phobia, talking about, I don't know, the school teacher in Batley in the north of England who remains in hiding several years after he was accused of blasphemy by local Muslim leaders in the north of England for talking about cartoons of Islam's founder, Muhammad. I mean, I wouldn't mind if the government was looking into Batley Grammar School phobia for its teachers, or the many other things. Like, I mean, how about what about looking into why one of our MPs, David Amess, was slaughtered by a jihadist a couple of years ago when he was meeting constituents? I mean, what are there more protections that the rest of the population can have against people driving cars into crowds, shouting Allahu Akbar and so on? Are we allowed to talk about the intimidation of journalists, writers, and others across Europe, and citizens, teachers, all sorts of people? Or are we just going to always have this pandering to a small community that makes itself extremely vocal, and unfortunately, as I said in that piece in the Telegraph, has this tendency to say, instead of we are ourselves going to separate out the extremists in our faith from everyone else, instead of doing that, say, how can we better protect our faith from any external criticism? I think this is a disastrous route to go down, and I'm afraid that the government will discover that in due course.
Well, it seems to be all about submission here. It's pandering, and it doesn't end in a good place. I can tell you that from someone who escaped an Islamist country. The pandering leads just to more demands, and it's bizarre at a time when we've had this explosion in anti-Semitism in the UK that there's so much focus on Islamophobia. So perhaps, I don't know, look at where some of that anti-Semitism comes from.
Right, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the things, is if you identify, for instance, the fact that significant numbers of Islamic hate preachers have at mosques up and down the country since October the 7th preached the most rancid hatred of Jews, and encouraged, and here we get into the real bit that should be illegal, actually encouraged the violence of terrorist groups like Hamas. What stage do you get to when even highlighting that, which isn't highlighted enough, could, instead of being a legitimate complaint about extremists in a minority faith group, be said itself to be a thought crime or a hate crime? They will never be able to work this out, these self-appointed theologians like these idiots from the British government and the former idiot Conservative MP. They'll never be able to do it, and they will never be able to draw as fine a line as they think they can, because such a line does not exist.
Well said. Now let's talk about something a little bit more frivolous. Tonight we have the Melbourne premiere or preview of Snow White, Disney's latest version of the classic fairy tale, but it's a woke reimagining. And Douglas, you wrote in the New York Post that Disney seems to be quietly terrified of how this project will fare, so much so that they are pretty much hiding the star of the movie, Rachel Zegler. And if you watch this, you'll understand why.
The original cartoon came out in 1937, and very evidently so. There's a big focus on her love story with a guy who literally stalks her.
Yeah.
Weird.
Super weird.
So we didn't do that this time.
Oh, gosh. Douglas, this remake is reportedly to have cost more than $200 million, and Disney seemed too scared to properly promote this movie.
It's quite interesting. Disney has had a terrible run of it because it's still as a studio trying to pump out the sort of material which might have been briefly thought to be a good idea in, I don't know, the summer of 2020, but really looks horribly dated and actually misreading the situation now. I mean, you know, I think I've said to you before, Rita, but in general, when they do these remakes, and they're done by people who hate the original. Like, you know, Snow White just has to be the woman she knows she can be and the leader she believes she can be. maybe you should just invent a different story and call it something different. Disney seem to know that they've got another stinker of a movie here. I might be wrong, but they seem to know, rather like their pretty woke remake of Peter Pan a couple of years ago that bombed at the box office. Disney clearly know that they've got to silence their star. And that's why last week the huge launch of the film was in the middle of nowhere in Spain at a castle that was said to have inspired the original cartoon. The castle in question is far away from most people. About 100 people were invited, which you can't say is the average sort of movie premiere setup. I mentioned in my post column, but as well as sending her to a far-off castle, you can't help thinking that Disney's executives must have been wishing they could also give the star a poisoned apple that would set her to sleep for many years so that she didn't appear in front of the world's press again anytime soon and diminish the movie she's meant to be promoting.
Oh, I'm sure they have market tested the reaction to Rachel Zegler and found it to be enormously negative. So we can understand why they try to hide her. But you're so right. If you want to have this empowering story about a woman who doesn't need a prince to save her, it's all about her career and finding herself, whatever write a new story. Why do you want to trade off the Snow White title and then completely change the story that people have loved for generations? Douglas Murray, you and I need to get into Hollywood and just straighten that place out. Thank you for your time tonight.
Thank you.